Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last month, the World Health Organization published a list of the 30 worst polluted areas in the country, areas which exceeded their limits. These included, perhaps not surprisingly, London, Liverpool, Leeds and Manchester. But they also included Storrington in my constituency. Storrington was in the 30 worst polluted areas in the whole country. It got worse than this. This month, Compare My Move reported that using the WHO data on the worst pollutants, which are fine particulate matter, the worst cities for air pollution were Bristol, Stansford-le-Hope, Swansea, and what they called the City of Storrington. And these places had a higher concentration of pollutants than London. Storrington was the worst place in the southeast. Well, the city of Storrington is in fact a village of just 7,000 residents, and it's right at the foot of the South Downs, indeed the South Downs National Park. It is in very picturesque country, and it is astonishing that it should be one of the places with the very worst air pollution in the country. And the reason that it is because of traffic which is being forced through the village. It was declared an air quality management area 8 years ago. A low emission trial was set up. That was abandoned after just 1 year, ironically because there was no mobile phone signal available in this rural area, and so the signals with the data couldn't be sent back. 3% of the traffic going through Storrington are heavy goods vehicles, but they're responsible for 30% of the pollution. Local people know that there's a very good reason why traffic is so heavy through Storrington, and why the air pollution is consequently so bad when that traffic queues. And the reason is that the traffic is forced up through the Downs because of congestion on the A27, which runs at the bottom of the South Downs through my constituency. This was once said to be the coastal highway, or meant to be the coastal highway, but in fact is in significant parts not dualled, and there is very serious congestion on the A27, including at Arundel. As a consequence, traffic aims to miss the A27 and the congestion. It runs through the historic town of Arundel in my constituency, and it runs up through the South Downs and through downland villages like Storrington, and this accounts for the terrible air quality. So there is a very strong environmental case for trying to do something about that traffic. And the obvious thing to do is to upgrade the A27 so as to make the traffic free-flowing along a route which is very important economically in any case, as the east-west connection on the south of England. At last, we have a plan that has been delayed for over 3 decades for the Arundel bypass. I'm very grateful to the government for announcing the funding for that bypass a few years ago, and recently Highways England announced the preferred route for the scheme. There is, of course, as there always is, some local objections to the bypass, but my judgment is there is overwhelming local support for it, not least because of all this traffic running up through the Downs and the air pollution in places like Storrington as a consequence. So it was therefore very surprising and disappointing when the South Downs National Park Authority announced that it would seek judicial review of Highways England's preferred route announcement. Here we have an extraordinary position, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have a public body using public funds through proper consultation, identifying the best route for a bypass that the government has announced the funding for and says is necessary. And we have another publicly funded body, the South Downs National Park Authority, paying absolutely no regard to the views of local people, local villages, the communities in the South Downs National Park, that decides on what is quite clearly a purely ideological basis to seek judicial review of a route and to prevent it from happening, simply because it touches a tiny section of the South Downs National Park right at the bottom. In fact, everybody knows that this will be a South Downs National Park relief road, and the Highways England official projections show that of the 15,287 annual average daily traffic movements through Storrington, causing all of this congestion and pollution, there would, because of the Arundel bypass on the preferred route, be over 3,000 fewer traffic movements on the first year the bypass opened, and that would be over 20% fewer. And by 2041, there would be nearly 6,000 fewer traffic movements, and that would be a reduction of 38% of traffic through the village. So the bypass would clearly prevent the problems of this queuing traffic in a downland village. And yet we have this attempted judicial review. The meeting was not public. No notice was barely given of it. Where is the accountability for this decision? And why isn't the South Downs National Park Authority made party to the collective decisions that ought to be taken by local authorities on environmental matters, including reducing air pollution? Why can they simply stand above that when it is clearly of such environmental benefit overall to the South Downs themselves and to the downland communities? Their actions are completely unacceptable, and local communities are rightly, in my view, very angry about what they are seeking to do. I have another village in my constituency, Calford, that also is over these statutory limits on air pollution. The EU and the WHO maximum levels are exceeded. That's an even smaller place, only 2,000 people, but it sits on the A272. Again, there is queuing traffic. Again, it was declared an air quality management area in 2011, but there's been no real action for 7 years. Again, 4% of the traffic are heavy goods vehicles, but 37% contribution towards the levels of pollution. The parish council wants a very simple thing. They want signs to be put up on the main routes either side of the village that run north-south, the A24 and the A23, to discourage heavy goods vehicles from taking the route of the A272. There are perfectly viable dual carriageway routes that go away from this road and from the village. There would be means to discourage heavy goods vehicles from taking this route. And yet what we have seen is a complete failure by the relevant local authorities to take forward any kind of real initiative to do the simple thing of introducing these signs. West Sussex County Council says there's no evidence to support the contention that heavy goods vehicle traffic would be affected by the signs or where they should be placed. It needs a feasibility study, but there's no funding for the feasibility study. So what I would like to ask the Minister is, I welcome the government's air quality plan that they published in July last year. I am not churlish about it as other honourable members were, because I think it represents a welcome step forward to taking action in places like Storrington and Calford in my constituency. And I note that the government announced a £255 million implementation fund to support local authorities in conducting things like feasibility studies. And I think £40 million of that was meant to be made available immediately. So can the Minister confirm that this fund is available to places like Storrington and Calford in my constituency so that they can conduct feasibility studies, and that the Clean Air Fund, which the government also announced, will be available to those local authorities if they then need to take measures as a consequence of the feasibility studies. Madam Deputy Speaker, we can't just let this matter drag on. This has affected these villages, in the case of Storrington, for well over a decade, and the same for Calford. What we need is energetic joint action by all the local authorities, and that needs to be supported in the way the government has suggested by government funding, so that studies can be commissioned and action can be taken. At the moment, there has simply been an inertia by all concerned. But when you have rural areas, tiny villages at the foot of the South Downs that actually have the very worst air pollution in the country, it shows that there is something wrong. It's completely avoidable, and it's time that we did something about it.
Kelvin Hopkins.